They did a 3-year study into media piracy in emerging economies, concentrated on countries like Russia, Mexico, and India, and essentially found out that all of this stuff about suing people, making it illegal, arresting folks, none of that works. No amount of anti-piracy enforcement will change the economics that drive copyright theft. You've got to make things cheaper. They cite the example of Russia, where legal versions of The Dark Knight sell for $15, which is roughly the same price you'd pay in the United States. But because wages are so much lower in Russia, that price represents a much higher percent of a consumer's income, the equivalent of selling The Dark Knight for $75. Pirate versions can be obtained for less than a third of that price, so boom, you go and you get the pirate version.
Right. Well, and the study also confirms, from a sociological standpoint, these countries where piracy is rampant are no less moral. They're no more likely to actually steal something or kill other people or whatever. It's just a case where the economics of the situation are such. I mean, here in America, triumph for size, imagine every piece of media that you buy instead of pirate suddenly costs 5 times as much. If you wanted that video game, suddenly it's $250. If you want that DVD, it's suddenly $75. I think in many ways, with services like Steam, with the iTunes store, we finally have a low enough price and an easy enough way to get a hold of media legitimacy that we're finally emerging. Many people are emerging from the dark days of rampant piracy here in the United States. But if all of a sudden stuff costs that much more, we'd be rolling back to piracy super fast.
In the United States, we can stop piracy, at least according to Daniel Castro, an analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, by putting in bandwidth caps.
What?
See, he says the government should allow pricing structures and usage caps that discourage online piracy. Because if you have a lot of bandwidth, that's all you use it for. It appears to be his contention.
Look, of all the places to try to sell us on that, a network where we stream live video and that we podcast out giant chunks of high quality data to people who want to consume it. This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous and offensive. And
Daniel Castro also suggests that deep packet inspection be routinely deployed by ISPs in order to scan subscriber traffic for potential copyright infringement. And Castro has a solution. If courts crack down on the practice, the law should be changed. Because, frankly, intellectual property is the only reason our country exists. If there were no intellectual property, we shouldn't even be alive. Brian?
There are certain times I just want so bad for Cory Doctorow to magically be at my side, to just grab the mic and just assail this kind of argument.
It's utter crap. It's born of the idea that the intellectual property industry is somehow the most important industry in the world, and that if it has even the slightest threat, that we should bring the full power of the law to bear against it. It's worse than murder. We should prioritize it above everything, and I'm sick of seeing it. Should there be laws against piracy? Sure. Should there be protections for copyright? Sure. But they are so far already beyond what is needed to create creativity, to encourage creativity. This sort of stuff is just ridiculous. It's laughable. What we should be having a conversation about is what will happen if we had no copyright law, and how do we protect against the negatives of that, rather than saying, we've got some copyright law, but you know what? It's going to take 1% off my bottom line this year. My industry's in decline, and so I really need the FBI to give up hunting actual criminals and start cracking down on copyright law. And we should have the government mandate bandwidth caps on all ISPs, because that'll help to deter the pirates. And you know what? Let's just make the world entirely inconvenient for everyone, because I need my industry to grow by 15% every year.
Well, this to you and me sounds like a ridiculous solution to handle things that way. But you and I haven't spent gazillions of dollars to finance, different members of Congress, to get legislation, to get certain people, I don't want to say under my thumb, but to get people to support my agenda. Like, you and I don't have the massive hammer of government to use to solve our qualms or problems with copyright law. And the part that drives me, and these people who do, of course, they're going to use it if that's what they can get away with. The crazy part is, if their goal really is to make the maximum amount of money from the maximum number of people, then study after study shows that if you lower the price and you increase the ease of purchase, you can tackle piracy. What was the study that said that the optimum price for an MP3 was a nickel, because at a nickel, nobody would ever bother to torrent anything. Nobody would ever bother to even put it on a USB to give to their friends. Everybody's just like, oh yeah, no, give me the whole album.
And the objection is we won't be able to continue our industry at that price level. And that is the wrong conversation to have. We should not be having a conversation on Capitol Hill about whether your industry will survive. What these copyright laws are meant to protect is creativity, and will there be innovation and new art? And at that price level, at 5 cents, will there be innovation and new art? I think we would find the answer is yes.
Absolutely, and it should be pointed out, to protect innovation and creativity for a limited time. This business that 100 years after the death of Walt Disney, the company will still own Mickey Mouse is ridiculous. This is another case of politicians that are bought, paid for.
He's not dead.
What's that?
I mean, he's not actually dead.
Are you talking about he's frozen?
He's in cryogenic.
He's in the middle of Space Mountain?
Yeah.
I saw him once when we were going around a loop. Exactly. He was like...
So that makes the law a little... Yeah, it's hard to interpret that. But you're absolutely right. I am so tired of this argument being hijacked, and you nailed it, Brian, which is we don't have the lobbyists up there making our side of the argument. That's the biggest problem. All right. I want to devote a good portion of the show today to discussing what's going on in Japan. There are a lot of issues there. We're not going to be CNN. We're not going to cover every issue of the earthquake and the disaster relief. There are great places to find resources there, but we can help point you towards some of those resources, and we can tell you a little bit about the technology. Most important, we can actually give you some on-the-scene reports from listeners in the Tech News Today audience who have been good enough to call and write us from Japan. I want to start off with the economic side of things, not because the human side isn't important. It is much more important. It's extremely important, but you can't ignore the effect. It's interesting to see, like, well, how is this going to affect business? And I was listening to the Economist podcast this morning, and they said, look, we always tend to overestimate the economic impact of natural disasters because they are so dramatic. It turns out usually they don't have nearly the effects that you think they're going to have. And there's an article out today in the San Jose Mercury News essentially saying that same thing. It looks like there's going to be a tightness in the flash memory market, but most of the industry seems to be okay. One of the lucky things is most industrial complexes are located in the south of Japan, so they weren't as impacted by the earthquake as the companies up in the north. The two most pressing concerns for the industry are damage to the transportation infrastructure and reliability of power, according to Dale Ford at IHS Supply. It could take as long as 2 months to resolve those problems. And I'm seeing that in a lot of places I'm reading. It's not so much that the factories can't work, or the factories are having a hard time getting back, but keeping them running and having the efficiencies of a constantly running factory is an issue because of the brownouts and the power issues. And also transportation. It's like you can make all the flash memory you want, but if you can't get it on a train and get it to a boat, and then get it shipped or get it to an airplane, it's going to be hard to sell it.
Yeah, and at first it feels a little bit morbid. Obviously, people are dealing with a massive, massive crisis on the other side of the world. But here in America, and I know we have listeners and viewers all over the world, it feels a little bit weird to be like, yeah, but well, my gizmos continue to be on time. But it is important to take a moment and take a long view and recognize what's going to happen to the distribution logistics of the way not only our electronics, but all the imports that we get from Japan,
right,
and all the affected areas.
Yeah, it's definitely not the most important story coming out of Japan, but that doesn't mean that it's should be ignored entirely. Some other really good stories coming out of Japan. Engadget reports today that AT&T, Sprint, Verizon, Dish Networks, Comcast, and Cox Communications have all announced plans under which free calls can be made to Japan, and as well as free text messages in a lot of cases between now and March 31st. So, for all the vitriol we were spewing at some of these companies earlier today, this is a good move, and I applaud them for it.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, and look, this is one of those times when it's like there's nothing but good to be done. You do good for the people. You do good publicity for yourself. We know the folks over at Apple kept their Wi-Fi on. They were allowing people to come in and actually bunk down in the Apple stores. It's brief moments like this where to see everyone come together and put aside, the bottom line for a brief moment makes everyone feel good.
Yeah, that Apple story is really touching. Kevin Rose had some emails that he posted on his blog about, it became that scene from the movie where everyone gathers around the electronics store and watches the TV broadcast, except for the modern era. Everyone was in the Apple store watching the live stream on the laptops that they have set up there. Also, Facebook set up a Japan earthquake page for users to find information about disaster relief. Google has set up a crisis response project. We've talked about that in the past, although an interesting spin on that. Google is now encouraging people to take photos of the posters with people's names with their cell phones and send them to an address tohoku.anpi.google@Picasa Web. And once sent, the photo will be automatically uploaded to the Picasa Web album, where people can view this and keep track of each other. NTT Docomo, Japan's largest wireless carrier, has set up a database where you can enter the cell phone number of a person to confirm his or her safety. Just a lot of coming together of businesses large and small in this effort to try to help people out.
Now, this is interesting. In the chat room, Stephen M. just tweeted or sent over to us that Verizon's offering free access to TV Japan through their Fios TV service.
So
and I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, that's great.
I think it's fascinating that we see how the interconnectedness of our society nowadays not only makes possible massive amounts of relief. We saw with the Red Cross donations, is so super easy just to donate over your phone, but also in prevention of disaster. There was a recent tweet from Scientific American saying, and I forget the number, it was millions or billions of dollars were saved by proper planning and preparation for the tsunami. And in a case where time is of the essence, once you have an earthquake and you need to get the word out that we expect a massive tsunami to happen and you got to get to high ground, then it matters that all of a sudden everyone in the country is carrying on them a mobile device that keeps them interconnected with the rest of the whole freaking globe. It would be amazing. I'm sure some fascinating academic articles years from now will come out talking about how different technology has essentially shaped this disaster, both in the avoidance of it and in the recovery of it.
And it's funny how copyright issues go away when real important issues come along. For instance, TSS Aloic in the chat room points out NHK World is live streaming on Ustream right now. That'd be something they'd be sending a takedown notice for in the past. But we find out what's really important in these situations and do what's necessary. Also, an interesting thing on the this is actually from Wired, talking about some of the games that were supposed to come out. We see this happen a lot when natural disasters come along. Games happen to have themes similar to the disaster, and everyone pulls them back. It's not censorship. It's just saying, you know what, this is not the right time for this. So IREM will cease development on its PlayStation game Zettai Zetsume Toshi 4, City in a Desperate Situation. And there are a few other PS3 games that are being delayed for release because they deal with earthquakes and disaster themes, and I think that's appropriate. I mean, I think they come under criticism for the opposite if they put them out for being insensitive and trying to profit at something like that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think let's face it, the reason these games are popular is because we're all fascinated with massive disasters. But then when one happens, especially when it's all too real, we certainly want to dial back our involvement. We saw that with 9/11. They pushed back the movie and made some changes to the movie Collateral Damage. And what's funny is the little ways. There was an on-campus cafe called Ground Zero out in Eastern New Mexico University that all of a sudden they were not real happy with that name. And likewise, the band Anthrax for a while, not happy with their name during that scare. And when I went to Whole Foods to get sushi, it was very weird to grab a box of sushi that said tsunami package. And I was like, that's not cute right now. That's it's a major disaster.
And it's just coincidence. It's just these things aren't planned that way, but then they strike us that way. Finally, before we get to some of the user feedback from listeners, there's a lot of discussion on the internet today about radiation risks, about what's happening at the nuclear reactors in Japan, and I want to point to Maggie Kurth-Baker's post at Boing Boing. She says she's in the process of putting together a longer post that will add some context to the concept of radiation, but she did actually, she's like, the nuclear scientists are a little busy right now. They're not responding to my emails because I'm not a priority. But she actually did get some good information from Dr. Catherine Higley, head of Oregon State University's Department of Nuclear Engineering and Radiation Health Physics. and says that information keeps changing from the Fukushima power plant as the situation changes, but one plant worker received a 10 REM dose. That's twice the annual occupational dose, twice what regulators have deemed safe for someone who works in a nuclear power plant. Now, the interesting thing about this, you may think, wow, twice the dose, that's horrible. But that risk translates into a 1% increase into having some sort of cancer or some sort of health risk related to that radiation. So twice the radiation does not mean twice the risk. Obviously, it raises your risk, but 1%, actually 0.5 to 1%, is a lot different. So I like, Boing Boing is doing a great job, by the way, of covering this and trying to bust through the FUD and say, you know, this is real. This is the PR that you're getting. This is what seems to be really happening on all sides of the issue, not just like, you know, busting the FUD of the power plant, trying to contain the information about what's really happening, but also trying to bust through, you know, people overreacting to the radiation issue. Radiation is a bad thing. I mean, I'm not saying it's okay, but you need to have some accurate sensibility about how bad it is in order to accurately estimate how bad the problem is.
Well, let me tell you, if you want to immediately cut past anyone's logic circuits and immediately make them scared, just mention nuclear radiation, because it's so counterintuitive. It's this thing you can't see, touch, smell, or perceive in any way that can kill you. Nuclear fallout, of course, is a real problem. But one of the things that, and this is in no way meant to downplay the danger of the situation, but as people start throwing around the word Chernobyl, people really start to get worried. I want to point people to, there's a fantastic speech by Michael Crichton that you can find on YouTube. I believe it's called Fear and Complexity. And he talks about how he wanted to create a global disaster. So he looked up some research on Chernobyl. The initial estimates at the time were that 2,000 people died at the accident and that upwards of 400,000 people died through later complications because of exposure to radiation and cancers and that kind of thing. As he dug into the numbers, the actual numbers turned out that around 50 people died during the actual disaster, most of whom, about 30 of them, were fighting the fire live on the scene, and that's where they died. And that long-term cancers and infertility rates were such that basically only 4,000 to the day. Now, of course, the speech was written a while ago, and of course, there's some fact-checking to be done on that. But that is a massive difference from a perceived disaster to the actual number. And the one thing he points out that blew my mind was that the World Health Organization did a study on what the biggest impact of Chernobyl was, and they concluded that the #1 negative impact of Chernobyl was not the radiation exposure. It was the perception of being told that you're going to die young, that you're going to be infertile, you can't have children, and that you've got nothing to live for. That's what caused the suicides and the early death rates and the unemployment and the malnutrition. And in this case, it wasn't that they were given bad radiation; they were given bad information. And as we do our next flirtation with this, it'll be interesting to see how our hyper-connected society tells the story of this potential nuclear disaster.
And it's actually the same issue we run in talking about politics. You run in and talking about radiation, where if you start to say, look,